thinking about it, and then we're going to dive deep into the message for us. Now, this reading is actually not a part of our lectionary, and you might see why. The people who created the standard readings for our Sundays selected Matthew 25, which is a very similar parable as the one that we would hear. And so we'll hear it again as we move into the season in which we hear Matthew's gospel. The other readings you heard, they are a part of what is standardly given for us to hear this Sunday. But I wanted to go to this text. It felt, my spirit wanted me to, I felt like we should think about the parable of the talents, the parable of the pounds, this one story that seems so much about how do we invest our lives. And so I went to Luke. Well, the thing with Luke's story here is that it's actually a mashup. You might have realized it as you heard these things. One is the story of the talents. Here it's the pounds, which is about 3 months' worth of a wage for a regular worker, 3 months' worth of wages. So say like $1,200, let's just say. So it's like that. People receive that amount and they have to invest it. But it mashes up with this story about a nobleman who goes off to get royal power and comes back and then exacts judgment. That story might be rooted in Luke's understanding of history, because during Luke's time, there was a lot of trying to figure out what had happened with the destruction of Jerusalem. And this story is part of the beginning of the fracture in leadership in Palestine. So there was this guy, the son of Herod, Archelaus, and he, after his dad died, went to Rome to become anointed king of Palestine. But a delegation was sent and said, no, we don't want that guy. Don't make him our king down here in Jerusalem. We don't want him. And so he was assigned to just northern Palestine, to Judea. And this was just as Jesus was in Egypt, as the parents had taken him south. So he was terrible. He was a terrible, brutal leader. He sort of foreshadowed all of the destruction that would come to Jerusalem. And you heard Jerusalem bookend this whole story. So there's an understanding that Luke is probably using these historical events to help us understand that Jesus' story starts in Jerusalem, but it ends with us all over the world. But I'm sorry, that was your little mini sermon, and now we're going to focus on the real sermon. Are you ready? All right, the slaves. The ruler gives the slaves instructions, and we are the slaves. Luke likes that term because slaves are servants. We are obeying our master, Jesus. And so, at the time that Luke is telling this story, all of us slaves, all those who are alive at that time, expected that Jesus was going to come back at any minute. They thought he resurrected, he said, it's on the way, I will return and you will see me in glory. And so they were thinking it was going to happen. There were 10 slaves, but then 7 died. Old age, health problems. Pretty soon there were only 3 that had actually been given the pound from the master. Why wasn't Jesus coming back? So Luke uses Jesus' story that we hear in Matthew as a way to help them understand. They don't know when the master is coming. We don't know when all things will come to completion. And that's not the most important question. The most important question for us is, what are we going to do with what has been given to us? What are we going to do with this incredible gift of the gospel, the hope of the knowledge of the love of God in our time and place? What are we going to do with it? Well, the first and the second, they invest their money and they come back, they invest the money, they come back with a return. It's not like they made $1 bazillion, and it could have been quite a long time before the nobleman returned. Back in those days, it wasn't like the nobleman flew to Rome and flew back on TWA or whatever, trying to be historical, TWA. But nah, man, this was a long trip. But even so, it could have been decades, right? So they make a good return. It's not great, but it's enough. And the ruler gives them their reward. One gets 10 cities and another gets 5 cities. But the third slave commits a multitude of sins because that one does nothing with the money. He goes and does what 2 Thessalonians tells us not to do. He's idle. He hides it. He just puts it right away and doesn't do a thing. The money isn't invested. Now, this story offers us some clear directives on how to invest the gospel hope that we have been given. First off, God expects us to maintain our relationship to God's self through action. It's not enough to have an idea about God and say the right things and post positive things on your Instagram account. It's not enough to simply say it. There is an expectation of doing it, of doing things. Our actions, our investments, are signs of our obedience. In the story, the money was given to them to do business with. Doing business requires engagement. It requires planning and time and commitment. Our time, our money, our relationships, our personal investment in our growth and well-being, those things flourish when they are centered in the life of Christ. And we at St. Paul's together, as we are sharing in that process, we're doing God's business. We're doing the most that we can with what we've been given. And when we do that well, things flourish. I think about what we do for our community. Even the buzzer going off at the beginning of the service is a sign that people know they can come here and find love and support. We do that really well. We could do more, but what we do really well, and it's a beautiful thing. But we have areas that we're not as strong in, what we may need to look at and have an idleness check on. I wonder if we invest enough in our church relationships. Do we see each other outside of church? Do we spend time together in each other's homes or elsewhere? Those relationships between each other are important investments. Did you know that children who come to church together and then go to each other's house to play, that they have done longitudinal studies and found that those children, when they become adults, tend to be more likely to stay in church? It makes sense, right? And what about our spiritual growth as a community? Are we engaging enough in the amazing talking book of Scripture? When we prayed at the beginning, we asked God to strengthen our love for Scripture. That process of reading and learning and inwardly digesting the Bible is enriched so much by doing it together. In Sunday school, we often go around the circle and talk about what is giving us joy right now. And the thing that gives us joy might have happened like on Monday, but when we talk about it again together, it just magnifies. It just grows in that sense of hope and affirmation that the gospel is alive and well in our lives, is present to us. Our individual contributions magnifies as we are together. So if you're not coming to Adult Sunday School, why is that? And if you want to gather at a different time because you can't get there or it's too early or whatever, make an investment somewhere in your life to dive into Scripture with others. It's important. It's a part of being a servant of the gospel. And now here's another thing. Investing in the gospel hope requires risk. The slaves took a chance. They do business, and business is inherently risky. Just watch the stock market these days, and we will see. There's always the potential of losing the money. There was no slave that came back and said, I tried to invest it, but, I invested in somebody's really crappy donkey, and it died after I bought it, and I'm really sorry. But it happens, right? Risk is like that. There's no guarantee that what we invest is going to bear any fruit that we can see. That doesn't seem to matter to God. What seems to matter to God is that we're doing it, that we're taking the risk. That's important to remember because for some of us, we don't want to take a risk unless we know it's not going to fail. God's not about that. God doesn't mind that failure. In fact, I have a friend who preached once, and he said the greatest failure on earth was that the Son of God died on a cross. And look what God did with that. So we don't have to worry about failing. But then there's that third slave. The refusal to risk was his issue. And ironically, his refusal ended up being terrible for him. He excuses his idleness by blaming the nobleman. He says, it's not my fault I didn't invest, it's your fault. I'm afraid of you. I'm not going to obey you. And one thing I have witnessed in my years as a priest is how insidious this way of thinking can be. From the outside, it seems like someone is the victim of another person's domination, when really, that person is avoiding personal responsibility. It's scary to take the risk of having an opinion, of facing conflict, of stating our position or our conviction. So instead, we allow the other person to go ahead and do the thing on our behalf, and later we blame them for it. A few months ago, we were invited to consider moving our community from this building into a larger church with more space for ministry and worship. We had to take a risk even to begin thinking about that because this space is beautiful. Why would we leave it? But as we did that, I heard from our vestry and our community complete openness. As we moved forward, people started to express their concerns and opinions. And then ultimately the decision was made and the door was shut, and we are not discerning anymore, leaving this space. But I wonder, were there those who were avoiding personal responsibility of standing up against that decision and expressing their dissent? Doing it is risky. Not doing it is not investing. Do you see it? Are you with me on that? This is so important because I know people in my life who really haven't grown in this area. And I'm not preaching to anybody here. I'm just saying it's a reality. So, why not speak? Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Why not speak? I'm not just saying that. It really is okay. Why not speak? What holds us back? The future is going to bring more situations. Maybe not a church move, but something else. Some other situation where we're going to have to take risks together and we're going to have to discern. And it's important that we invest, not hold back and call somebody on the phone and say, can you believe Pastor Rebecca wants to do blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? That's an important part of all of our investment in gospel hope, is speaking our conviction, speaking our opinion. If we fail, we fail, but we will fail and not do well if we do not stay invested together. The future will bring those situations, so let's be ready to take a risk. It's risky to give money. It's risky to give time and trust. Jesus said, unless you take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. That's a huge demand, and it's a risky one. Essentially, he's saying that you have to be willing to risk relationship, willing to die in order to live, willing to be vulnerable in order to grow. We can choose courage or we can choose comfort, but we can't have both. Vulnerability is having the courage to show up. That's what Brené Brown tells us. To be seen, even when we have no control over the outcome, being willing to show up. So the ruler in the parable takes a huge risk too, right? He goes away entrusting a bunch of slaves with his money. I mean, how often would anybody really do that? It's a risky thing. And that is the final answer. Because when he invests, when he leaves, he comes back and rewards the slaves extravagantly, even for the most modest progress. That's how we live our lives too, with the expectation of that reward, seeing it over and over. God rewards us for our slightest effort. We make this tiny little step and God matches us fivefold. The reward is so disproportionate. They invested $12,000, maybe they got $36,000. It's not a lot of money in the spectrum of the universe, and yet the ruler comes back and puts them in charge of 5 cities, 2 cities, leadership, power, strength in numbers, all of that. And do you notice that they're rulers and he's a nobleman? You know what that means? They have the power to subvert him. The level of trust that the ruler gives these slaves is incredible. And that's us. We are entrusted. We are entrusted with big and little, and our life investment matters. It is a requirement that we give. How much we give is important because it matters that we've decided to take a risk for our faith. That's what matters. Your pledge this Sunday, this is Stewardship Sunday. This is when we think about how do our finances match up with our faith. What the amount looks like is incidental. What the action means to you is what matters. What it means in your relationship to Christ, in your investment. And whether you invest here at St. Paul's or whether you invest in the World Food Program, that's up to you and God. It doesn't have to be here. But what matters is that your generosity is a central part of your faith. So don't forget that. Don't think of this simply as, oh, I've got this pound, I'll put it in there, I'll just bury it in there, and I've got this little amount. Grow it. Take the risk. Trust that the reward will be tremendous. I don't know how it works, but I know that the power of grace upholds and surrounds and magnifies our giving so that we never have to worry that God will provide. I don't worry about St. Paul's financially because I know God's got our back. Our gift is a measure of our trust and our gospel hope. So invest your life in walking with and knowing God, in experiencing what that means all around you because you are steeped in love and grace. Look for it. And when you invest, trust that it will return to you in surprising, sustaining, and even overwhelming ways.